gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, I want to thank you very much for coming. This is a pleasure I've been looking forward to for several months. Normally, when we have a very distinguished scholar, we talk about lots of things, and Kenneth Seeskin here is Philip M. and Ethel Klutznick Professor of Jewish Civilization and Philosophy at Northwestern University, and he's got lots and lots of publications. He's an extremely productive scholar. But the reason we're here is because he was one of my teachers in graduate school more than 35 years ago at Northwestern. And my wife, Leah, was raving about excellence in college teaching, and one of the books that she had kept mentioning Ken. And Leah said, by the way, have you ever heard of Ken Seeskin? I says, oh, I remember, of course, in spring of 77, we did Plato's Ethics, and in spring of 78, we did Aristotle's Metaphysics. And I can remember very clearly the teaching, so I can personally testify to what an excellent teacher he is, and very excited. We've been doing some reminiscing here. Lots of memories are coming back. His method of teaching is not to give straight lectures. And so he's going to kind of model what he does and raise some provocative questions, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. You know, you're always worried whether your lecture is going to go over. There's always an element of nervousness in that. And if you're being asked to speak about good teaching, if you fail, you're doubly damned. So I'm going to try to do my best. I promise no negative comments about Aaron Rodgers, and we'll see what happens. Okay. Well, as Brad told you, what I teach is, I teach philosophy, I teach the history of ideas. You probably won't believe this. I also teach on a fairly regular basis, both New and Old Testament, not in a faith-based setting, but in a critical reading, critical thinking setting. Good teaching, from my perspective, it's not a cookbook type thing. It isn't that you take out a stick of butter, 2 eggs, and a cup of flour, and there's a set method where you can simply follow the rules and get to where you want to get. And I'm not here to tell you that there's a one-size-fits-all model for how to conduct a good classroom. Each of us has a personality, and each of us projects a personality in the classroom, and there are obviously different personalities. There's the showman, is one model of teaching that can be successful. There's the tender, loving care model of teaching that can be successful. There's the in-your-face buddy model, and there's the Socratic questioning model, and certainly others. Part of what I think anyone has to do is decide what is your personality, and has to be clear on what your personality is and project that to the students fairly on in the course so they know what they're getting in for. And I think it's clear, at least I hope to everyone. You need some personality or other in order for this to work. It doesn't have to be, as I say, I'm not going to force one personality on everybody, but I think we all need one and ask the question, look yourself in the mirror, what am I? What am I trying to accomplish? If you ask me, well, how do I do it? It's a cross between showman and in-your-face buddy. Okay, so let's talk about in-your-face buddy. And that goes to today. I like interruptions. I like questions. I don't consider them insults. I consider them compliments. And I think generally if I don't get comments, questions, and objections, something has gone wrong. So we have 50 minutes. I'll try to cover everything, but absolutely you should feel free. So if you're sitting there and thinking, Seeskin, how can you get away with this? Let me know. And quite possibly I can't or I shouldn't. Okay, what is the goal? How would I define successful teaching? The goal, as I see it, is to take students from a passive perspective vis-a-vis knowledge to an active perspective vis-a-vis knowledge. Or to put this in another way, you don't want students to think of themselves as mainly consumers of knowledge. You also want them to think of themselves as producers of knowledge. Now, there is part of education is consumption. You've got to get certain material under your belt. I agree. But the consumption goes only so far, and it's not even 50%. The trick, if there is one, is to get them to be producers. So let's talk for a moment about the Socratic Method, which is a method I use, and perhaps we all use at one point or another. There's more to the Socratic Method than just asking questions. That's the simple part. Anybody can do that. You call on somebody in class and start firing questions at them. There's a lot more to the Socratic Method than that. What you want to do, when it works, is to get the questions to lead to a dimension of discovery. You want to convey to them that they are actually discovering something, and that's part of what's going on in the educational process. You want to give them, in my case, you want to give them the feeling that while Plato or Descartes or Kant or Thomas or someone might have said something before them, that nonetheless they have somehow come upon these insights themselves. They can appropriate them, and they can see these insights as what they themselves have arrived at, conclusions they themselves have reached, even if it's perhaps a bit late in the game. There's nothing more rewarding than having a student come into your office and give you, for me, a long argument, and I say, look at them and say, thank you, Immanuel Kant, okay? Because it means now that when they pick up Immanuel Kant, it's somehow theirs in a way that it's not if there isn't this element of discovery. Now, Aeschylus, if I can leave Socrates alone for the moment, although we'll come back to him in a bit. In the Agamemnon, Aeschylus has the chorus say the following: that knowledge comes alone through suffering. And that's, I think, to a large extent true. You've got to suffer in order to learn. Now, it's not as bad. Look, I mean, the Agamemnon is a tragedy. I mean, it's not quite as bad as it seems. I mean, Agamemnon gets chopped up in little pieces, and the pieces get fed to the dogs. It's not quite that bad. At least I hope it isn't. But the basic insight that there's going to be a struggle and there's going to be suffering is essentially right. And so let's pursue that. How do you encourage discovery? And how do you deal with suffering? Anybody want to? I see a hand up. Or were you just reaching for your fork, or what? No. All right. If you're ready to. Okay. My way of looking at this is to convince the students that the pathway to knowledge always involves making decisions. And that's what I mean. You can't just be a consumer of knowledge. The pathway to knowledge always involves making decisions. You can't just sit back and take things in. If you do, then you're not really learning. So the way I try to convey this is, for example, on a reading list, typically I organize my reading lists so that anytime somebody's asserting something, there's another author we're going to read in class who's denying it. So for every argument that we get from philosopher X, we're going to get the opposite argument from philosopher Y, and what happens then? on the exams or on the term papers, I always either encourage them or perhaps force them, if you will, to decide who's right. What are both sides of the argument? Who's right? Why? So you always have to make a decision, and you have to do some form of evaluation. I have to say, I even do this even if you're teaching Scripture. So let's talk about Scripture for the moment. Scripture is full of heavy ambiguities. I mean, you can open up to almost any passage you want. It's not completely clear what's going on. It's extremely abbreviated. In fact, sometimes the abbreviation can drive us crazy. As I often tell my students, you don't need a Cliff Notes when you're reading Scripture, because the abbreviation and condensation's already been done for you. But if you think about it and just take sort of very basic episode, the Garden of Eden, it takes me 3 class periods to work through the Garden of Eden story. If you're going to read it close, what exactly happened? There are all kinds of traditions that have developed from this, all kinds of interpretations, and I tell students when we're discussing this material, you can pretty well bet there's going to be a question on the midterm or the final, which interpretation is stronger and why. So you have to take sides. For me, you have to take sides in a controversy, and I typically pass out in the student handbook, the course materials, a thing that's entitled How to Write a Critical Paper in Philosophy. And one of the portions of that says that the stronger you make your opponent's argument, the stronger will be your grade. The weaker you make your opponent's argument, the weaker will be your grade. I don't want anybody trying to refute straw men or straw women. I don't want anyone to mischaracterize the strength of their opponent's argument. And I often tell them, even if I think in the end your opponent has the better case, to the degree that you have characterized your opponent's argument correctly and given your opponent his or her due, it is to that extent that I'm going to read this paper favorably. Does it always work? No. Pity. But sometimes it does. And when it does, then I get the feeling that education is really going on. My role as a teacher typically is as an adversary. So here we will deal for a few minutes within your face, buddy. Questioning is, for me, essential to the learning process. As I indicated before, sometimes it happens, but as a rule, I generally don't like to come into a class and just lecture for 45 minutes and then have 5 minutes of questions at the end and we all go home. Unless there are comments and interruptions, I feel I'm not really doing my job. If the students aren't asking questions, then I immediately assume they're not paying attention. And sometimes they don't. We'll talk about failure in a little while. So how do I start? I often start a class with, you guys, or as we say in Chicago, yous guys, you guys think it's X, but I'm here to prove to you that it's really Y. In other words, I'm here to prove to you that your normal way of looking at something, whether it's pleasure, sin, the scripture, knowledge, whatever it is, your normal way of looking at it is wrong. You've just got it wrong. So it's me versus the rest of the class. There's nothing more satisfying. Sometimes it's the opposite. This is what I call the mystery novel approach. It could be X. There's a good reason to think that the answer to our question is X. And it could be Y. And there are very good reasons to think that it's why. And now, which one is it? And if you're successful at that, a third of the class will side with X, a third of the class will side with Y, and a third will be making up their mind. So that's what I call the mystery novel approach. Is it the butler, or is it the chauffeur who committed the murder? The good reasons, lots of evidence for either one. It's what they always say about writing a mystery novel or a mystery story: keep them guessing, and that's what I try to do in a classroom. As you might expect, simplistic explanations are always rejected. So if for me, when I present an argument or an idea or we introduce a thinker, I always try to say, all right, here's the simplistic reading of this. Here's the simplistic reading of Aristotle, and here's why it doesn't work. Here's the simplistic reading of Kant, here's why that doesn't work. But they completely disagree about the role of happiness in human life. The simplistic reasons, let's get those out off the table so we can have a serious discussion. Here's the simplistic reading of the Garden of Eden. Eve seduced Adam and offered him the apple, and we're all damned or shamed ever since. Okay, let's get that off. It's much more complicated than that. Now, let's go back to Aeschylus for a while. The path to knowledge, knowledge alone comes through suffering. From my perspective, this is after years of reading Socratic dialogues, but I'll try to broaden it. The pathway to knowledge is never straight, and it's never even, and it's never predictable. It isn't the case that you ask a question and you just make steady step, one foot in front of the other progress until you get to the end. It's much more realistic to say that the pathway to knowledge involves detours, it involves blind alleys, it involves the necessity to make fresh new starts, and I often find myself doing that. All right, we didn't solve the problem last week. Let's make a whole new start and see if we can do any better this week. Cases in knowledge where we're not even sure that we're asking the right questions. And that happens as well. And part of what it means to become educated is learning how to deal with these kinds of pitfalls, or perhaps I should say, to be more seasonal, potholes. So I'll give you an example. When I teach Aristotle, the hardest part of the course is we spend 3 class periods watching Aristotle paint himself into a corner. In other words, we take 3 class periods of his raising, and Brad sat through this a long time ago. 3 class periods of, here's the problem that he's asking, here are the constraints that he has put on himself, here's the dilemma that he creates for himself, and here's why, given the resources at his disposal, he doesn't have the ability to solve it. Now, whenever I do that, I always get a substantial, at least a third of the class that says, why are we reading this? If he didn't solve the problem, then tell me, why am I wasting my time watching somebody not solve a critical problem in how to look at the world? Answer, because that's the way knowledge works. I want you to see what happens when one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived can't solve the problem that he himself has raised. And guess what? If it's going to happen to him, it's going to happen to you. And I want you to get comfortable with that feeling. I want you to get comfortable with the feeling that you're stuck. And then I want you to find a way to deal with it in a sensible manner. So, if we take this side, we're going to pay a price. Is it worth the price to have a coherent answer? Or we take the other side, we pay a price there too. Is that worth the price to get a coherent answer? Or do we just say, sorry, our method doesn't allow us to solve this kind of a problem right now, but we still have to move on. So I have a running quarrel, and I hope I don't offend anybody now. But I have a running quarrel with science textbooks. I hope I'm not about to get thrown out of here. Not all science, but the problem with a lot of science textbooks, in my opinion, is that what they say is, and what they should say, here is the latest account of how we explain these phenomena. Here is the best we have. Okay. But if you're really going to do it right, I think, science, too, has historically, has had blind alleys. It's had periods where it's asked the wrong questions. It's had questions that it didn't have the ability to completely resolve for us. What I'm afraid of with my students who are science majors is that they get the impression that the path to knowledge is just hypothesis, data, confirmation, conclusion, and keep marching forward. It's just not the case that all experiments are successful. There are things to be learned from failed experiments. It's just not the case that all reasonable people always agree on how to look at the world scientifically. It's not now, it's rarely been. Maybe it's important for even people doing chemistry and physics to appreciate what it's like to go up a blind alley. And maybe a textbook should have that in it too. Now, if I'm skeptical of the impression of knowledge that comes from science textbooks, I'll tell you who I think gets it right. You're not going to believe this, but I'll tell you who I think really gets it right, and that is military historians. Why? Because even when you look at the winning side, forget the losing side for a moment. Let's take the invasion of Normandy. Okay, let's forget Hollywood. Let's forget the world at war. Let's forget World War II in color. Let's forget, what was the Steven Spielberg movie? What? Saving Private Ryan. Okay, well, that was a little bit better. Guns at Last Light, if you've read that book, which was a Pulitzer Prize winner. What was important about that, and I think any good military history book, even on the winning side, how much failure, miscalculation, miscommunication, and misunderstanding went on. Okay? Even the invasion of the greatest amphibious assault of all times, there were hundreds of failures, despite years and billions of dollars worth of planning. And the question was, if you want to understand why that succeeded, you have to raise the question of how the individual soldier, all the way up to Eisenhower, how they dealt with the things that didn't work. And there were an awful lot of them. And that's what I think we have to convey to students about trying to become educated or trying to learn something. Another way to put this, you can see what I'm talking about now is struggle, that there's a struggle involved in getting it out. So I think Aeschylus is right. Another slant on this, if you want to think of it this way, if this is helpful, would be to go back to Socrates for a moment. I think if you read the Socratic dialogues carefully, Socrates isn't just giving his respondents an intellectual challenge. He's doing at least that. But it isn't just that he's putting before these people, here's a logic problem for you to solve, and if you solve it for me, we'll all be fine and go home. That's wrong. He's also putting in front of his students moral challenges as well as intellectual. Okay, so if we think about the classical virtues, courage. When your argument has been refuted and you've been shown not to know what you're talking about, which is what happens in a Socratic dialogue, it takes a lot of courage, as the song says, to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again. It's not an easy thing to do. There's a real tendency in all of us when we've been knocked down intellectually to quit. And so his respondents, time and again, when they are refuted, the key thing is not just on what point did they miss out, but how do they handle the fact that their definition or their argument didn't succeed? Answer, most of them fail the test. Most of them take a cowardly way out. It's too bad. Temperance. Part of both teaching and learning, it seems to me, is you can't claim too much for what you know, but it's equally wrong to claim too little for what you know. And one of the hardest things that we all face is getting right of exactly where we stand vis-a-vis our subject matter or our research interests at this point. That's a hard thing to do, and it is a moral virtue to have a correct assessment of where you are and to be able to live with it. Justice. How do you deal with someone who's just shown you up? How do you deal with somebody who's asked a devastating question? How do you deal with somebody who's just published an article and whose data or whose arguments really take you to pieces? And the obvious way that people deal with this, read any academic journal, is hostility. If you look at the Socratic dialogues, look at how many people get hostile to Socrates. Socrates is eventually accused of implied to get executed, as we all know. The people became very hostile of this guy. Now, justice, if nothing else, requires of you to treat your opponent or treat somebody with a different point of view from you with decency and respect. And that, too, is a moral virtue. So the path to knowledge requires, in addition to intellectual exertion, it requires a great deal of moral exertion. If we think back to the Socratic dialogues, of all the characters in all the dialogues that Socrates appears in, the best one, the one who passes the test of courage, temperance, and justice, I think, if you're familiar with the Socratic dialogue, none of the noblemen. It's Meno's slave, if you've ever read the dialogue of Meno. He's a slave. And he shows up his master because he's got the courage to keep going and doesn't become hostile and still wants to learn. And his master, Meno, is a complete disaster. His master gets angry and starts screaming at Socrates. Now, all of these things, the development of courage, temperance, and justice, all of these things require a struggle. And so, again, I put it to you that Aeschylus is basically right. All right, more on failure. Let's talk about failure. Can we talk about this, failure? The first thing I want to say about failure is what I will call, for want of a better moniker, the Michael Jordan principle. Okay, the Michael Jordan principle is this. We look at it and we see the highlight films. And we see him flying through the air and dunking the basketball, and we see buzzer beater shots and, incredible leaps and so forth and so. If you were, in those days, a diehard fan in the way that I was, then you knew that there were long periods when Michael Jordan couldn't buy a basket. He couldn't get the ball anywhere near the basket. Those don't make the highlight films. But they were there, and he admitted it. So here you have the greatest basketball player, certainly of his age, possibly of any age, who had periods when it just wasn't there for him. And that happens to every teacher. There are periods when it just doesn't come together. Doesn't mean that necessarily there's something wrong with you or necessarily something wrong with the class. But just as there are failures that have to be dealt with in the pathway to knowledge, there are failures that have to be dealt with in the person who's trying to convey knowledge or inspire knowledge. And to me, it's very hard to deal with, but it's something that we do have to deal with. Of giving your all and putting yourself forward in front of a classroom and leaving it with the impression that you have failed. And it's going to happen. It's going to happen if it only happens 25% of the time during the term, you're doing your job well. Okay? But it does happen. It's a little bit like this. If you're like me, you go to a party and somebody says something at the party, and then when the party's over and you're driving home, or the next morning you think of a really witty comeback. If only I had answered it, holy. And that happens to all of us, and it often happens that way in a classroom. Sometimes some of what I feel are some of my best ways of formulating a problem or asking a question come after the class is over or after the term is over. So what is the solution? The solution for me is, if you fail, and you're going to, be honest about it. So I have, on any number of occasions, gone before a classroom and apologized for a previous class. And just be perfectly honest. I'm sorry I wasn't as clear as I could have been. I'm sorry I didn't really respond to the question that was put to me. I trivialized it. I gave a simplistic answer. Your question deserves much better. Let's try that one over again. And in any given term, I think an instructor has to face that, apologize, be honest, and go forward. It's another way of thinking of a pitfall or a blind alley. You've got to fight through it, and you've got to be honest about it, which is, again, a moral as well as an intellectual challenge. Years ago, to be quite honest, 1995, I went to Northwestern's football practice. This is in an age before the football players were thinking about going out on strike. And so I'm watching practice, and the starting offense actually had 5 or 6 of my students. So when practice is over, I went up to one of my students and said, Ron, you guys looked absolutely fabulous today. I said, Mike, you guys were clicking on all cylinders. It was a pleasure to watch. He was the student, I was the professor. And he answered with something that I've never forgotten and that I repeat to myself again. It's a pity that he's not here. So he turns to me and he said, you know what? He was the philosopher in this case. This was his senior year. He turned to me and he said, you know what, Professor Seeskin? You're never as good as you look, but you're never as bad as you look either. So on the days when you think you've hit the ball out of the park as a teacher and you're floating on air, so it's a marvelous feeling. There's nothing that compares to it. It's probably not as good as you think. And you probably need to back up and retrench and go up. It's probably not quite, I hate to be so sobering. On the days where you think you walk out of a classroom and you say, good heavens, that stunk. I mean, how here I call myself a professor and put on a performance like that. Ron would have us believe you're probably not as bad as you think either. You probably got more material across than what you are now giving yourself credit or lack of credit for. So I think this has been, it's on that message that I think I'm going to end my remarks. You're probably never as good as you think. You're probably never as bad as you think. Credit to Ron Johnson. I don't know what he's doing right now, but I would love to have an open the floor, and I take it that there's still some time. Brad.
I remember that Aristotle course, and it was on the metaphysics.
It was.
And at one point you pick up and you turn over to the Nicomachean Ethics, and you start reading his first few words, and you go, where does he get this stuff? He's assuming all sorts of things. Where does he get this stuff? And that was a way of obviously kind of shifting a little bit from the specific text there to another of his texts, and saying, okay, here's the constraints that he's putting there, and maybe he's aware of some of them, probably is. He's a very bright man, but he also maybe some things that he's not fully aware of, and then you shift it back. And could you speak a little bit of how you sometimes use what I would call triangulation, where, you know, to give a perspective on some of the constraints or assumptions or premises that are unspoken, you kind of look at a similar text.
Well, look, part of what philosophers are trained to do is trained to look at presuppositions, trained to think that there's nothing that's presuppositionless, that as soon as somebody says anything, you have to ask about the presuppositions that underlie it. That's why it's very hard to ever get any business done at a philosophy department meeting. So I don't know how many, if there are any philosophers in the audience. The trouble with a philosophy department meeting is that somebody, raise their hand and say 2 and 2 is 4, and what's going to happen is that everyone will turn around and ask, well, what are the presuppositions of that? They're not going to let you get away with, so you never really accomplish very much. Which is too bad. It's a little bit why I've moved into the religious studies department now, where we get things done much faster. In the case of Aristotle, Aristotle inherited a Platonic worldview and wanted to show, and tried in a respectful way, that his teacher got it wrong. In terms of his teacher's metaphysics was wrong. This isn't going to be technical, so relax. He tried to distance himself from his teacher. His teacher, in your life, his teacher was a Platonist. He wanted to be a nominalist. And the problem is that he inherited so much from his teacher that he found it difficult to make a complete break. And so, in certain passages in the metaphysics, you can follow this. It's almost like a checkerboard pattern. You'll get a paragraph or two where he sounds like, you know what, maybe Plato was right after all. Then you get a paragraph or two where he says, Plato couldn't have been right. I'm offering you something new way of looking at the world. Don't worry. Trust me, Plato's wrong. And he goes back and forth and back and forth. Now, why? Because the presuppositions of Platonic philosophy had made such an impression on him that he couldn't completely liberate himself from them, much as he tried to. And that often happens with people. I'll stick my neck out, perhaps, not just in philosophy, but in science or literature. Religion, we can't completely, even when we want to, completely liberate ourselves from the background that we've inherited and the ways of looking at the world that seem obvious to us. Much as we would like to break the bonds, we can't quite do it. And that was that's why he painted himself into a corner.
I guess going back to what you were doing there, what I saw you doing is you helped us identify things to say, okay, well maybe I haven't fully broken away, maybe I haven't really looking at it from perspective, and so from the standpoint of modeling teaching practice, that's what I got out of this.
Yeah. Well, I had one success, but I'm probably not as good as I think. Okay. Someone else. Yes. By getting it, the trick, if you can do, the key is to get them to feel that they've got to make a decision. Is the purpose of human life to seek happiness, or is it something else? Now, this is not a question that is very easy to be neutral on. All right? Is the purpose of human life to fulfill our moral obligations, or is the purpose of human life to fulfill ourselves as creatures and seek happiness in some extended sense of happiness? Now, to me, it's very hard to come down on a neutral position on that. Does God exist, or does God not exist? Is there irredeemable evil in the world around us, or is there not? Is it all in some sense redeemable? What I try to do, at least, is to raise questions where even a student who's struggling a bit with the material feels that he or she has an answer to one of those questions. And even if it's not a very sophisticated answer, it's something you can start with. Okay, you think that the purpose of human life is to seek happiness. Fine. Kant didn't, but you do. Then what is happiness? And what's so good about happiness? And is there nothing else in human life that trumps happiness? Does obligation or love or faith not, in some case, trump your happiness? Now, they may not be the most perceptive student in the world, but at least once you've got that on the table, we have dialogue going. And they have to make a decision, and then once they make a decision, they have to defend it. Now I can play Socrates. But you can't play Socrates if they don't have an opinion on the subject matter that you're trying to acquaint them with. That's my wife over there. This is going to be a question I'm sure I won't be able to answer.
It seems to me that what you're saying works well with philosophy of history and law, but what about if you're teaching accounting, basic accounting, and what you've got to do is get across the system, and they have to understand the system, and how they feel about it really doesn't matter. They've still got to take the system as it is.
And where there is a right answer, there really is a right answer that they got to get, or your taxes aren't going to work, and you're going to get put in jail, for example. But I think those of us who teach science.
All right, correct me if I'm wrong. Every year, the Wall Street Journal makes up a tax return, a hypothetical tax return, gives it to 50 accountants, and generally gets back 48 different returns. So I'm not quite so sure that it's as cut and dried as it may seem. I grant you that philosophy, the humanities, the literature, religion are more open to different ways of looking at things. I grant that, and I can only talk about from my own perspective. I grant that in any discipline, there are certain things you need to just get under your belt before you can get on. There's terminology, there are bodies of evidence, there are characters in novels, etc., etc. I would like to think that in any discipline worthy of the name, however, there is some point at which you can reach debate, difference of opinion, difference of interpretation. It may not come as quickly in accounting as it comes in philosophy. But I'd like to think that at some point it's there. And therefore it would still be worthwhile to do research on this subject, because not every question really is answerable as simply as it may seem. Yes, ma'am.
There are like 7 of us here in this science teaching. And
All right.
I was thinking what you were thinking, Leah. For example, today I'm getting ready to review my earth science students on how you identify rocks. It is a slate, or it is a granite, or it is anthracite coal, and there's nothing, no coming down how you feel.
Agreed.
But really, there's not. But we did minerals first, and now we're doing rocks. And one of the things that I will show them in the last week is a movie on blood diamonds, because diamond is a mineral. And that's the whole story of the human suffering and the really horrible way diamonds are produced, especially in Sierra Leone. And after they see that movie, it's like and I'll say, now let's talk about diamond engagement rings, which so many of you ladies are going to sometime wear, and so many of you men are sometimes going to be shopping for. Do you feel different about a diamond engagement ring? Now you know it's a mineral, you know the characteristics of the mineral, you know it's a hardness of tin, you know how it's on Mohs scale, but how do you feel about it coming out of the potential? Can't be tracked. Is it Sierra Leone blood diamond or not? So I think there's a way to do it, but I think the percentage of the semester that I spend on that is minuscule compared to
Yeah. All right, but let me ask you a question about the categories you've just given us in Mohs scale and so forth and so on. Was that always the way people organized
Yeah,
this
Mohs
material?
scale, it's merely which is hardness, which
Right.
and a mineral is its ability
Scratchable.
to scratch another mineral, and certain minerals are the standards.
Right, but were the categories that we use to look at rocks or minerals, have they themselves undergone an evolution?
Oh, sure, but that's not
And if so,
your time
well,
about in the semester, or they don't get the content that they need to, say, take an environmental geology.
yeah, you're the expert, not me. I'm the outsider. I'm the critic now. Maybe it is worthwhile making students realize that the categories that we use, helpful though they may be, were not always available to people, who and why they were developed, and if in some cases they don't quite work. As I understand it, Mohs scale isn't always accepted. Now there are other ways of testing hardness. I hope that's right.
It's for a beginning 100 level.
Okay. So, all right, it's a question of the gentleman straight back in the room.
How do you assess and document teaching effectiveness? I've had debates with fellow colleagues about, they claim that it's student evaluation, right? And it's not. How do you assess?
Well, yeah, Northwestern has student evaluations, and they're okay up to a point. They're telling you something. Usually student evaluations are telling you something at either end of the scale. They're either telling you that somebody's fabulous or that somebody's incompetent. But they don't tell you a lot in the middle. Now, what I do with my teaching assistants and often with people in my department is to sit in. So I sit in on people's classes. I tell them I'm going to do it. I don't surprise people. But I sit in on their class in the back of the room, sometimes more than once. And when it's over, I write up a report and try to help them. I have a teaching intern now. Somebody's teaching heresy in early Christianity. And I have videotapes of his class, and I'm about to meet him next week to talk about what I think he can do to improve his teaching. So I don't want to throw out student evaluations, but at least the ones I've said, they're never the be-all and end-all. Helpful though they are, that you need more. Go ahead. What I evaluate is how active the students are, how good their questions are, the teacher's ability to respond to the question, the teacher's ability to make difficult material comprehensible. Is the teacher ignoring the questions, or is the teacher really getting heavily, deeply into the issue that the students have raised? If I sit in on a class, and I have done so, where no hands go up, people come in, the teacher teaches maybe one question, and then everyone leaves when the bell rings, I put that as a criticism in my evaluation. Something didn't work. Something misfired.
Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time, and want to thank Professor Seeskin very much for what he did.
Thank you.